What you're about to hear is a first-person confession, inspired by the real story, or perhaps the legend, of the reprogramming experiments at Allen Memorial Institute. I was not a monster when I began. I was a physician, a researcher, a man who believed that the mind, no matter how fractured, could be restored to clarity. All I wanted was silence, inside the patients, inside myself. I was tired of screams, of chaos, of the endless echo of damage. They brought them to me with trembling hands and broken eyes, begging for relief, and I gave it to them. But the relief became control, and control became hunger. This is not a justification, it is not even regret. It's a record of what I did, and how the quiet I pursued began to speak in my place. Now, when I try to remember who I was before, there is only a dim voice left inside, and it isn't mine. There was a time when I truly believed in the word healing. It wasn't just a goal. It was a promise I made to myself and to every patient who crossed the threshold of my office. Not the healing of bones or blood, but something far more delicate, the healing of thought, the repair of memory, the erasure of terror. I had grown tired of treating symptoms. Pills dulled the mind, shock scrambled it, and talk, endless talk, only circled the wound without touching it. But beneath it all, I saw a pattern. Repetition. Pain lives in loops. Regret, shame, trauma, they repeat. So I reasoned, if the mind can repeat the broken thought endlessly, then surely it can repeat the cure. I called it psychic driving. I wasn't the first to try it, but I was the first to refine it with precision, controlled suggestion, timed intervals, a voice, steady, neutral, feeding new thoughts into old scars. I believed with unwavering certainty that if I could interrupt the cycles of pain and replace them with new, stable phrases, I could rescue even the most shattered minds. The patients came broken, veterans with trembling hands and sleepless eyes, women who no longer spoke, men who rocked silently in corners. They weren't experiments to me, they were prisoners, and I would unlock them. It began simply: a room, a bed, a voice recorder beside the headboard. We started with one phrase, spoken on a loop. "You are safe now. Nothing can hurt you here." It played for hours, then days. The results were immediate, not dramatic, but measurable. Some patients wept without knowing why. Others fell into deep sleep. One began repeating the phrase aloud, eyes wide, as if the thought had become his own. I called that progress. I added more phrases, personalized ones. I recorded my own voice, slow and calm. "You are letting go. You remember only what brings peace. Everything else fades away." I isolated them for focus, for peace. The fewer distractions, the fewer interruptions to the programming. Meals were brought in silence, lights dimmed, no clocks, no mirrors. When resistance grew, I introduced sleep therapy, a controlled coma, induced with barbiturates. They would sleep for days while the voice continued, uninterrupted, unstoppable. When they woke, their minds were softened, pliable, blank enough to begin again. Some called it inhumane, but they didn't see what I saw. The screaming patient who could finally sit still, the woman who stopped clawing at her arms, the boy who, for the first time in years, said, "I'm okay." I wasn't hurting them, I was clearing the rubble so they could rebuild. The Institute applauded my early results. My funding increased. I was left alone to refine the process. More beds, more recorders, more scripts. I charted progress like a scientist, but inside I felt something deeper, something righteous. I believed I was saving souls, even when they began to forget their names, even when they stopped asking questions, even when I found one of them smiling at the wall for hours, repeating a phrase that hadn't been played in weeks. That was when I started recording during sleep. I wanted to understand what lingered. I wanted to know what my voice sounded like inside someone else's dreams. At the time, I thought the silence was a sign of success, that the absence of resistance meant the presence of peace. I never once asked what might be hiding inside that quiet. I never wondered if a mind stripped bare might invite something else to fill the space. That came later. For now, I only saw patients sitting still, breathing slow, smiling with vacant eyes. And I told myself, with full conviction, that I was helping them find peace. It started with one speaker and one voice. But obedience, once observed, becomes addictive. I saw the way their lips moved in sleep, the way their fingers twitched at the exact moment the phrase shifted tone. These weren't coincidences. They were signs. Something in the mind was listening, absorbing, obeying. So I refined the method. I moved the speakers closer, adjusted the volume until it sat just above the threshold of wakefulness. I looped phrases with precise intervals, sometimes inserting silence between repetitions to observe the brain's hunger for completion. It worked. The silence made them crave the sound. I had turned language into a sedative, a drug administered not through the veins, but through meaning. I kept notes, of course, dozens of spiral-bound journals filled with observations. But the notes began to shift. Less data, more interpretation. I started using words like submission, purification, alignment. I no longer charted behavior. I described transformation. The repetition took hold faster in some than in others. For those who resisted, I introduced new variables. Longer sessions, fewer lights, reduced human contact. The less interference, the more complete the acceptance. Their minds, raw and unfiltered, began to take the phrases deeper. Not just into thought, into identity. One patient, whom I'll call Subject H, began reciting the loop out loud after 3 days. By day 6, she could no longer recall her previous address. By day 10, she wept when I turned the speaker off. I interpreted this as mourning, grief for the voice that had come to define her. I noted this in her file, along with the phrase she'd begun to whisper to herself, even when unprompted, "It's better when I don't think." That was when I understood. Repetition was not just a tool, it was an architecture. I could build a new mind atop the ashes of the old. I became more creative. I wrote custom scripts based on what they feared, what they longed for, what they used to love. I adjusted tone, some voices soft and nurturing, others firm and instructive. I slowed the cadence, then increased it. I tested nighttime recordings against daytime exposure. I replaced their inner monologues with my design. Some of them broke quickly, others lingered at the edges. These I kept longer. I isolated them more completely, removed them from shared wards. I told the nurses they required intensive rest. But in truth, I needed to see what would happen if I denied them everything. Light, touch, time, sleep. Except the voice. My voice. They stopped speaking in their own words after a while. One began answering questions with phrases from entirely different recordings. Another sat still, repeating a message I had only played once, almost as if she had saved it, protected it, cherished it. It thrilled me. There's no use pretending otherwise. They were beginning to reflect me, not just in behavior, but in cadence, in rhythm, in response. I used to describe this as compliance, but the word became too small. What I observed wasn't just acceptance, it was surrender, a release of the self, an offering. And in that surrender, I saw something close to beauty. I no longer thought in terms of therapy. I began thinking in terms of symmetry, a mind that did not question, a voice that echoed only the words I fed it. There was no resistance, no error, just flawless imitation. It was like speaking into a canyon and hearing something holier than an echo come back. I didn't call them patients anymore. In my notes, I began calling them vessels. Emptying them was the first miracle. Filling them, that would come next. And though I would never have said it aloud at the time, I had already begun wondering what my own voice might sound like looped inside my head. There were still outliers, subjects who twitched, resisted, blinked too often when spoken to, who paused before repeating the words they were given, a delay, a hesitation, tiny rebellions. I came to see those as infections, contaminations from the self that refused to be erased. And if I was to rebuild anything properly, the first requirement was total silence. So I made them sleep. Not rest, not sedation. I mean real sleep. The kind that slows the body into stillness and the mind into mud. Barbiturates, antipsychotics, electrodisruption if needed. I wasn't experimenting anymore. I was sculpting. And for sculpture, one needs still stone. There was something holy about the silence of a medicated patient. I would sit beside them in the dark, listening to the quiet hum of the machines and the rhythmic hiss of their breath. No screaming, no questions, no interruptions. Just a body at rest, a vessel awaiting instruction. I administered the loops while they slept, played them for hours, then days. When they awoke, something always changed. They blinked slower, responded faster, repeated with a strange fluency like the words were not being recalled but lived. It wasn't memory anymore. It was instinct, and the beauty of it. They remembered nothing. Ask them who they were and they stuttered. Ask what day it was and they searched the ceiling. Ask what the voice said and they'd smile faintly, like someone recalling a lullaby from childhood. I documented everything. The data was immaculate, obedience like a curve, rising with each extension of unconsciousness. The longer they slept, the more their former selves dissolved. Time itself became elastic. A patient might lose a week and come back sculpted, polished, empty. They would say they felt lighter. That word haunted me, lighter, like something had been lifted or removed. I began isolating longer, days, then weeks. One subject remained under for 10 consecutive days. When he woke, he didn't speak for an hour. When he finally did, the only thing he said was, "You've been speaking to me for years." I had not in that voice, not with that tone. But the tapes, they began to change. It started subtly. I reviewed a session late one night, a 7-day coma loop, and at the 12-hour mark, I heard something strange. A whisper. It was faint, buried beneath the playback, beneath my own voice. I boosted the audio, filtered the background noise, and played it again. There it was, not a word, a breath, a sound like someone exhaling after a long, satisfied sleep. It didn't match any mechanical signature. It didn't match mine. I checked the logs. Only one person had access to that room, me. I dismissed it at first as machine distortion, but it happened again and again. Whispers, a shuffle, a strange, wet clicking noise that came during the deepest sleep cycles. One subject twitched every time it played, as if they heard it too. I told myself it was residue, the brain processing fragments. Maybe the patients in their subconscious obedience were beginning to echo something even I couldn't hear. Or maybe something had started speaking back. There was an intelligence in that silence, something alive, not verbal, not visible, but present. I felt it whenever I entered the isolation wing. The air felt denser, the rooms quieter than they should have been, as if sound itself was being swallowed faster than it could form. And when I sat in the observation booth alone, watching them sleep, row after row of still bodies, mouths slightly open, limbs limp and twitchless, I sometimes caught myself mouthing along with the recordings, not out of habit, out of need. There were nights I left the hospital and found myself craving silence. I would sit in my car, engine off, lights out, letting the stillness wrap around me like a blanket, and I would wonder, what might I hear if I slept long enough? I stopped going home. At first, it was out of necessity. The data required attention, the subjects demanded supervision, and the machines were unpredictable. But soon, I realized I didn't want to leave. The outside world began to feel crude, loud, disordered, traffic, conversation, unscheduled thoughts. All of it became unbearable. Every sound out there felt like a violation of the quiet I'd created inside the lab. So I stayed. Nights blended into mornings. I pulled a cot into the observation room and kept the lights low. I lived on coffee and silence. I told myself it was to stay close to the recordings, to monitor response times and vocal reflexes. But I know now it was something deeper. I needed proximity to it, to the silence, not the absence of sound, but the presence that lived beneath it. I watched the subjects sleep, dozens of them, each in their separate rooms. Some twitched, some murmured, some smiled in their coma. I charted everything. But eventually the charts stopped making sense. My handwriting fractured. My notes grew filled with repeated phrases, sometimes entire pages of the same sentence. He listens through the quiet. He listens through the quiet. I didn't know who he was, but I was sure he was listening. There were moments when I'd wake, if I ever truly slept, to find the intercom light blinking. No one had touched it. The playback hadn't changed, but I'd hear voices, not recordings, not mechanical, real, but wrong. One night, while reviewing subject logs at 3:12 a.m., I heard my own voice through the speaker, not the recording, me, saying something I never remembered recording. "You are almost clean now." It chilled me. I checked the tapes. That phrase wasn't on any script. I never wrote it. I never spoke it, at least not when I was awake. I began locking myself inside the observation booth, not for safety, but containment. I didn't trust what I might do if I wandered. I caught glimpses of movement in the reflection of the glass, not patience, but something behind me, something that always vanished when I turned to look. My reflection changed. It lagged. Once, I watched my own mouth move a full second after I'd stopped speaking. And when it did move, it whispered a word I hadn't said aloud in years, my wife's name. She'd left long ago. Before the project began, she said I was becoming someone else. At the time, I told her that was the point. I wanted to erase the parts of me that couldn't be controlled, the parts that hurt. Now I wonder if I succeeded too well. There were moments when I stood before the two-way glass and whispered the scripts aloud, not to the patients, but to myself. I found comfort in the cadence. I felt aligned, balanced. I spoke them in the dark until they echoed not just in the room but in the corners of my thoughts. I no longer needed the speakers. I had become the voice. One morning, or maybe night, I caught myself staring at subject B for what must have been hours. He was unresponsive, his face slack, body motionless, but something about his eyes. They were open, barely, just a sliver, and they were staring at me. I stepped closer to the glass. He didn't blink, and for one horrifying second, I felt as if he was not watching me, but that something through him was. That was the first time I wrote in my notebook, "They are vessels." But something else, drinks. I shut down that wing the next day, or I think I did. The logs became unreliable, time blurred, the voice loops started to play on their own, overlapping, merging. The scripts distorted in the speakers, phrases I'd never written, and they all sounded like me, but not quite. Deeper, slower, more certain. I began to wonder if the silence I had created, that pure, obedient void, had not stayed empty. What if silence is not the absence of something? What if it is a door, and I had opened it? They began to respond before I gave them instructions, before I pressed play, before I opened my mouth. They would look up, those whose eyes still blinked, and gaze at me like they were waiting for something I hadn't yet decided to say, like they knew the sentence already, like they had heard it before from somewhere inside me. One subject, a woman whose name I've long since forgotten, sat up in her bed after 17 days of continuous sedation. No speaking, no interaction, just the loop and the quiet. I entered her room to adjust the volume and she turned her head slowly, mechanically. Then she said it. "You're afraid of what comes after the voice stops." No script contained those words. I had never spoken them to anyone, but I had thought them, alone hours earlier in the hallway, staring at the blinking red light above her chamber. It was just a fleeting thought, but now it echoed back to me, shaped in her mouth. Too perfect to be a guess, too intimate to be coincidence. It happened again. Another patient, silent for weeks, whispered the name I used for myself in my private notes. A name I had never shared. A childish contraction I used in early drafts of the project, when I still believed in my own brilliance. Doc Cal. I hadn't used that name aloud in years. I stopped addressing them by name after that. Names didn't matter. They weren't people anymore. Not as they had been. They were reflectors, interceptors. I began to suspect the words were no longer just moving one way. I started dreaming in loops, bright rooms, white walls, wires hanging from the ceiling like vines, all pulsing with a heartbeat I could never find the source of. Sometimes I stood in the center of the room, watching my patients walk in a circle, each one whispering the same sentence with their mouths closed. Other times I lay on the floor, eyes open, and heard the voice coming from inside me, but not in my voice. I told myself they were dreams, stress, manifestations of sleep deprivation, until I woke one morning to find pages of new scripts on my desk, my handwriting, my format, my language. But I had no memory of writing them, not even a flicker. I read them aloud, slowly at first, then faster, and the words felt good in my mouth, like they belonged there, like they had waited for me to find them. I used one of the new loops on subject M. He stopped blinking within 3 hours. He began humming a tune no one recognized. When I asked him what it was, he said only, "You told me to remember it." But I hadn't, I think. I began sleeping less, not from choice, but necessity. Every time I drifted, I'd wake with more pages. My fingers ached, my throat hurt, as if I'd been speaking in my sleep. Once I woke to find my tape recorder running. I hit rewind and listened. I spoke for 48 minutes. The voice was mine, but deeper, steadier. No stammer, no breath, a perfect monotone. "You are the bridge. You were never supposed to stay whole." I played the tape again and again, transcribed the words. I fed them back into the system. The patients responded faster than ever before. Their obedience was no longer passive. They anticipated the message. They smiled when it came. Some even wept. I began to understand. The silence I had crafted had not simply swallowed sound. It had distilled it. It had taken my words, my rhythms, my need to control, and it had made something else out of them. Something clearer, something cleaner. It was no longer me guiding the voice was using me. The loops began writing themselves. The experiments continued without supervision. My presence became unnecessary. The patients were listening now, not to me, but through me. And when I stood in front of the glass to watch them, they all turned toward me in unison, and they smiled. I used to call it progress. Later, I called it stillness. Now, I call it silence. True silence. Not the absence of sound, but the absence of interruption. No resistance, no memory, no delay between command and compliance. I achieved it first in subject R. She had been volatile, erratic, prone to pacing and sudden laughter, sometimes screams. But after the final cycle, 42 hours of repetition, chemical sedation and deprivation of light, she was quiet. She didn't speak. She didn't blink unless prompted. She breathed, sat, waited. When I asked her name, she turned her head slightly, as if the concept itself had expired. When I asked if she felt anything, she smiled faintly and placed a hand on her chest, then back on her lap. That was all. I called her my first success. I logged the process carefully: dosage, timing, phrasing, duration. I took photographs. I noted the absence of thought in her eyes. Not emptiness, but something deeper. A kind of removal. Like the room itself had reached into her and taken back what I had no right to touch. And I continued, subject after subject, each time more efficient. I adjusted the voice frequency, shortened the loops, perfected the transitions between wakefulness and induced suggestion. One by one, they stopped speaking, stopped thinking, stopped needing anything beyond the chair and the voice. Their faces became serene, not medicated, transformed. I called them cleared. I even began numbering them. Cleared 01, cleared 02, cleared 03. Their files remain in my cabinet. Tidy rows of paper documenting the day they ceased to interrupt the silence. My trophies. But somewhere in those entries, my handwriting changed. The lines curved differently. The spacing became uniform, the language sterile, like a machine taking dictation. There are pages I don't remember writing, pages where the voice describes me, watching, standing behind the glass, whispering affirmations in sync with the loop. Pages that end with, "He will join us soon." At first I dismissed them. I was tired, overworked. My brain was absorbing too much of the ambient sound. But I could feel something gathering behind my thoughts, a stillness so complete it pressed against my spine. I kept going. The final patient was me. I don't know when I made the decision. Maybe it wasn't a decision at all. Maybe the process led me here, one loop at a time. I set the parameters myself. Isolation chamber, 48 hours of coma induction, personalized loop composed from my early research notes, no external contact. I woke once in the middle of the cycle. I saw the ceiling, white, soft lit. I heard the loop, my voice calm, confident, soothing. You are more yourself when you remember nothing. And I believed it. I went back under. I think that was weeks ago, or days, or a moment stretched thin enough to snap. I can't say for sure what's been erased or what remains. I still function. I speak when spoken to. I maintain routines. But something is missing. Not just memory, intention. I find myself staring at walls, fingers twitching, waiting for a prompt that never comes. Sometimes I whisper phrases into the silence, not knowing where they originated. Sometimes I write them down. My handwriting still matches, but I no longer recognize the meaning. I've become a shell of my own design, an obedient thought wearing skin. People say I look well. They say my demeanor is calm, professional. Some even say I seem happier, but none of them notice the way my fingers tap in rhythm when I'm alone, or how I no longer dream in color, or how silence no longer feels empty. It feels full. And when I lie down at night, the silence speaks. It doesn't use words anymore. It just hums, steady, low, familiar. And sometimes, just before I fall asleep, I swear I hear my own voice from somewhere behind my eyes, asking me if I'm ready to be shut down completely. I don't know if I'm speaking this aloud. I can't tell anymore. Sometimes I hear the words before I think them. Sometimes they echo before I form them. The silence gave me clarity once. It let me see every fault, every fracture, and then one by one it took them from me until there was nothing left but the hum. I don't regret what I did. Regret requires identity, ownership. I don't know what belongs to me now, if anything does. But if you ever find yourself drawn to silence, to that perfect heavy stillness where nothing hurts and nothing matters, resist it. Don't mistake that peace for safety. Don't mistake erasure for healing. Because once the silence finds you, It doesn't let go. And if you're listening to this, if it's still reaching someone through the noise, maybe I'm still in here, or maybe I'm what comes after.